you very much. I'd just like to go back to this gap where the chairman started to start with, Sir Bill. As I understand it, the gap in terms of the procurement budget in 10 years' time will be 6 billion if the MoD assumption of 2.7% growth in the budget is maintained for each of the next 10 years. Then in 10 years' time, the gap would be 6 billion. Is that right?
If I could...
I just want to, because that's a predicate to my next question.
Not quite is the answer to that question. First of all, these figures relate to the whole defence programme and not just the equipment programme. Secondly...
Do you mean, when you say the whole defence programme, you mean the whole defence budget?
Yes.
So if I take the defence budget and I grow it by 2.7% for 10 years, 2.7% each year, I get to a number which is 6 billion less than you would need to fulfil your procurement requirements.
Which brings me to the second point I was...
Sorry, is that right?
Only if by 2.7% growth you mean an addition to the cash figure each year by 2.7%.
Yeah, it's probably best to ask the National Audit Office this, because
we're not talking about real terms growth.
Yeah. Let me just clarify this, if I could, with Mr. Banfield. What is the number that grows by 2.7% each year and in 10 years' time results in a 6 billion shortfall?
It's an increase of 2.7% each year, cumulatively, and at the end of the
in the cash figure.
Yes.
In the cash figure of the entire defence budget.
Yes. So
right.
We go from the end of the current.
And if I grow that at 2.7% for 10 years, I end up with a number which is 6 billion less than required for
the defence budget.
For the procurement bit, or for the whole defence?
For the whole thing.
Right. Okay. And if it's flat, then I'm 36 billion adrift.
Yes.
Okay. So, Bill, 2.7% growth is 27 times larger than the current growth of the economy, which is 0.1% we heard yesterday. So you're not going to get 2.7% per year for the next 10 years, obviously. What are you going to do?
Well, this is why, rather tiresomely, I drew out the point that we were talking about a 2.7% cash increase.
Yeah.
It is not a real terms increase. That base assumption, which I agree is questionable given the general economic conditions that we're in, simply assumes that there's a general provision for inflation in the underlying provision each year. In other words, that the defence budget does not grow in real terms at all. Now, that compares, for example, with the last 10 years in which it has grown by, in real terms, in addition to inflation, by about 1% a year or so, a little more than that in some years. So in the jargon that we tend to use internally, that scenario is flat to real. It means that you preserve the purchasing power on a very general assumption about inflation.
The 2.7 is flat to real.
And 2.7, yes. I mean, it means that it also means, incidentally, that defence...
My question is, given that you're not going to get that, I mean, it's blindingly obvious you're not going to get that, because even flat to real, 2.7% is 27 times larger than the present growth of the economy as of the announcement yesterday. What are you going to do?
Well, 10 years is a lengthy period, and the alternative assumption that the NAO report offers, which is so-called flat cash, in other words, we reduce year by year the size of the defence programme by a couple of percentage points or so. Between 2 and 3%.
Hang on. Mr. Banfield, I understand flat cash to mean the money they've got now they continue to get in cash and no more. It's what used to be called cash limits in the early 90s. Is that right? So that means you have the same amount of money that you had, but because of defence inflation and stuff, you would end up practically having to cut things.
Not because of defence inflation, because of general inflation.
Yes.
I mean, the 36...
All right, but because of inflation, anyway, which we hear is worse for...
The 36 billion,
defense.
which the Comptroller and Auditor General knows that I would have preferred it not to be cited in the report, because it makes a pretty arbitrary assumption about a very long period. The 36 billion assumes that if...
But isn't it... Hang on a minute. You'd have preferred it not to have been cited because it makes an arbitrary assumption about a pretty long period. What it actually does, surely, which is what you're uncomfortable about, is it holds your feet to the fire and says, here are the consequences of your present spending decisions, either if spending remains where it is now, or if it doesn't even grow in line with inflation. That's all it does, and that's useful information for Parliament and the public to have.
well, one could speculate about what...
And what you've been doing for years is robbing Peter to pay Paul and ducking and hiding and weaving with apparently the connivance of the Treasury, because the Treasury seems to have been au fait with what you've been doing. And the thing that this report's done, which caused such a stir when it was published, it's made things clear. That's all it's done, hasn't it?
My only point, Mr. Bacon, is that the 36 billion figure assumes that year by year for the next 10 years, the real purchasing power of the defence budget reduces by between 2 and 3%. And there's no provision at all for general inflation, pay increases, nothing. Now, I don't know whether that's a realistic assumption or not, but to walk round to the answer to your original question, what we do is we have a defensive view, because
it just describes the extremes, the two bookends, the parameters,
precisely.
And that's actually useful information. Obviously, nobody expects it to be 36 billion, because you'll take decisions which will mean that it won't, but it describes, in a way that I think is quite helpful for the general public and for debate and for Parliament, the universe within which you're operating. But the fact that you didn't want it to be cited, I think, tells us a lot about the way you've been doing business for years and years.
The General wants to comment.
Well, I would say, I mean, first in our report we characterised it as an illustration, not a prediction. I think that's right, isn't it? And secondly, I don't regard it as by any means the extreme end of what we could have put in the report had we wished to be alarmist, to be quite frank. Because if you actually look at public comments made by a number of bodies about what they'd expect to happen over the next 4 years, and you then say, well, so if there was a much more severe regime in only the next 4 years, the rate of subsequent growth in the budget be required to retrieve that would be in double digits, and that's quite an unlikely event. So we took a view, understanding, and we had long discussions with the department about it, understanding the implications, we took a view that in the interests of reality it was necessary to produce some actual concrete number to illustrate the scale that we were potentially talking about.
Well, that's a very interesting phrase, CNAG. I think in the interests of reality, and I'm glad the NAO has published this figure, it is reality that the MoD has been hiding from for a long time, isn't it? Ducking and weaving, and if there's a problem with an equipment program that's supposed to take 8 years, you suddenly say, well, we'll just have it take 9 years, as if somehow time is a free gift. We've just discovered, just the carrier alone, I find these figures absolutely staggering. I was at a breakfast yesterday, and John Hutton, who used to be Defence Secretary, was speaking, and one of the things he said was, in the public sector, ministers and civil servants often talk about £200 million as if it's just a sort of small sum of money that's neither here nor there. It's not, he said. And he's right, but we're talking here about 674 million, which are costs, according to this report on page 5, purely attributable, net cost increases, which are purely attributable to the decision to delay, not to bad management, not to bad project management or anything else. Can you just explain to me the nature of this net increase of 674 million? Is that mainly extra payments that you're being required under the contract to make to the contractor because they're going to be having their shipyard tied up for a year longer than they thought of, or what?
It's broadly payments of that sort, and because the expenditure will be incurred over a longer period, there's a substantial element of inflation in it as well.
That's correct.
General background to comment.
Well, a substantial element of inflation. How much inflation?
It's
I mean, it's only 1 year extra, isn't it? Or how many years extra is it? The decision to slow the rate of manufacture of the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers is leading to this net increase of 674 million. That's a decision to slow the rate of manufacture by how many years?
between 1 and 2 years, depending.
So between 1 and 2 years, so between 12 and 24 months. So when you say substantial extra inflation,
250 million
of extra inflation.
of extra inflation over the 2 years.
Really? Well, what's the total cost of the aircraft carriers?
5.3.
So it's just a little, somewhat in excess of 5
5 billion.
5 billion.
5 billion.
250 divided by 5 billion gives you 5%. So you're just assuming 2.5% inflation per year for 2 years on all your costs, in addition to the extra payments you're having to make to the manufacturer. Is that right?
I mean, to be clear, Mr. Bacon, I am not for a moment, and I hope it was clear from my answers to earlier questions, arguing that this was a decision we would have made in any other circumstances. It is a decision which ministers took.
Can you just remind us when the decision was taken? to slow the rate? When was the decision taken to slow the rate of manufacture?
It was taken in the latter part of 2008.
I know it was 7 months after the contract was signed, but exactly when was the decision taken?
The latter part of 2008.
But the credit crunch started in September. Well, Northern Rock, which this committee took evidence on, was September 2007. It was very clear there was a problem by much earlier in 2008 than December 2008. It was clear that tax revenues were dropping off a cliff by much clearer than that. Why did it? What I find difficult to understand is why you signed the contract to commit you to this stuff, and then only 7 months later you commit yourself to a slowing down, which will cost you an extra £674 million. The education budget for the county of Norfolk, not just my constituency, but for the whole of the county of Norfolk, is £434 million for a year. This is more than that. It would pay for all of that for a couple of years, a year and a half. It's a if you add on the astute, the extra cost delays from that. It would pay for all the education of all children in Norfolk for 2.5 years. These are staggering sums of money, and you almost do it casually. How can you sign a contract and only 7 months later reach a decision with such calamitous consequences for the public purse? I realise it was because ministers decided to, but you're advising ministers.
This was certainly not remotely something that was done casually. It was the considered reaction to the kinds of budgetary pressures that I described earlier in the session, in a situation in which the options which would have had a more damaging effect on longer-term military capability were extremely unattractive to ministers for obvious reasons, particularly given that we hadn't had a defensive view for some time, and in which there was also a strong and understandable desire to redirect resources towards more operationally relevant priorities. And presented with a range of ways in which we could take cost out of the programme, ministers at that time decided that, suboptimal as it is, for all the reasons we're discussing this afternoon, delaying the carrier was least bad.
I've run out of time. Thank you. Spill, I just had one question about a comment you just made. You said that we have had a tendency in the Ministry of Defence to be over-optimistic. Do you use the techniques of optimism bias in project appraisal? Because they're well established and have been for years. I remember being in a seminar in the Treasury. I see our Treasury Officer of Accounts laughing. I remember being in a seminar in the Treasury years ago where optimism bias was discussed. And I don't know how widespread it now is in its use in project appraisal throughout Whitehall, but it's been around for quite a few years. Do you use it?
We do. I think it's fair
How
to
long
say, whether we call it that or not, we certainly do. And as I said earlier, we are consciously building skills in cost estimation and creating within the department an independent cost assessment function whose assessments of cost will be authoritative and will be the only ones that we work to.
Generally, you look like you were about to say something.
Only that, no, POS is absolutely right. Where I think we've got it wrong in the past is there have been more than one set of costs, and they're suppressed. The front line wants the kit, industry wants to sell it to us. My teams in the past have perhaps been over-eager to get onto the project.
It's not an unfamiliar...
No.
This is the world.
Absolutely.
And if you're buying a car, there are different sets of costs. I mean, actually, there are different sets of lawyers, depending on what answer you want as well.
But what we have done now is set up a cost estimation organisation, which Lord Drayson has decreed will be the one and only true cost that we will all use. And that'll be an independent cost.
When you say that will be, when will it be set up?
Well, I mean, it's set up already, but it's not big enough to look across more than the major Cat A projects. It needs to be able to look at the Cat A and Cat B projects. It needs to give the Admiral independent advice on costs.
Just for the clarification of the committee, what is a Category A and a Category B project?
Cat A is over 400 million, Cat B is over 100 million.
Right. So Mr. Hutton was right, wasn't he? You needn't answer that. Thank you very much, Chairman.